Captain Lee Minho stood in the cramped repair bay of Volix Prime Station, watching smoke pour from his ship's main engine. The acrid smell burned his nose as he ran a hand through his black hair. 3 days ago, the steady hand had been cruising smoothly through hyperspace. Now it sat dead in the water, and he was stuck on this backwater trading post in the middle of nowhere. How bad is it? Minho asked the station mechanic, a 6-armed creature called a hexapod whose name he couldn't pronounce. The mechanic's multiple eyes blinked in sequence. Very bad. Human. Your quantum drive core is cracked. Need rare minerals to fix. Cost many credits. Minho's jaw tightened. He had been exploring the Outer Rim for 6 months, mapping new trade routes for the Earth Colonial Authority. His mission was supposed to be routine, but nothing about this situation felt routine. The nearest human outpost was 3 weeks away, and his emergency beacon had been silent for days. What kind of minerals? He asked. Zeterium crystals. Very expensive, very hard to find. The hexapod's voice carried the tone of someone delivering bad news. Maybe you find in lower markets. Black market sellers sometimes have. Minho nodded grimly. He had heard about Volix Prime's reputation before arriving. The station operated in a legal gray area, far from any major government's influence. Pirates, smugglers, and worse, came here to do business that couldn't be done anywhere else. If he wanted to get home, he would have to venture into that world. An hour later, Minho walked through the station's upper levels toward the transport tubes that led to the lower markets. The main corridor buzzed with activity. Alien traders hawked exotic goods while travelers from dozens of species hurried past. The air recycler struggled to keep up with the mix of different atmospheric preferences, leaving everything smelling like metal and ozone. He passed a group of tall, blue-skinned Altarians discussing shipping contracts in their musical language. Near a food stall, short, furry Brickens argued loudly over prices. Everyone seemed focused on business, money, and getting what they needed. It reminded Minho of the worst parts of human space stations, but with more tentacles and fewer safety regulations. The transport tube descended for what felt like forever. When the doors finally opened, Minho stepped into a different world entirely. The lower markets were darker, grimier, and filled with the kind of people who preferred shadows to sunlight. Narrow corridors branched off in every direction, lit by flickering neon signs in languages he didn't recognize. Weapons, hissed a voice from his left. Best weapons in sector. Information for sale, whispered another from the shadows. Know where enemies sleep. Minho ignored them and pushed deeper into the maze. He had dealt with black markets before during his military service. The key was to look confident but not threatening, interested but not desperate. Show weakness. Here, and the predators would circle like sharks. He found the mineral dealer's shop wedged between a cybernetics clinic and something that might have been a bar. The Vorjak behind the counter was massive, with gray skin like stone and tusks that jutted from his lower jaw. His small eyes studied Minho with obvious calculation. Human wants something expensive. The Vorjak rumbled in broken standard. Zeterium crystals not cheap. How much? Minho asked, keeping his voice steady. The dealer named a price that made Minho's stomach drop. It was 3 times what he had in his account, and that was if he liquidated everything he owned. The Vorjak seemed to sense his shock and smiled, showing rows of yellowed teeth. Maybe human has other things to trade, the dealer suggested. Vorjaks always need workers. Strong human worth many crystals. The implication was clear, and it made Minho's blood run cold. He was being offered the chance to sell himself into slavery to pay for his repairs. The casual way the Vorjak made the suggestion told Minho everything he needed to know about how business was conducted down here. I'll think about it, Minho said, backing toward the door. Think fast, the Vorjak called after him. Good deals. Not last long. Minho left the shop and wandered deeper into the lower markets, his mind racing. He needed those crystals, but he wasn't about to become someone's property to get them. There had to be another way. Maybe he could find work, earn enough credits over time. It would mean staying on Volix Prime for months. But it beat the alternative. That was when he heard the crying. It was faint at first, almost lost in the noise of the busy corridors. But something about the sound made Minho stop and listen. It wasn't the angry complaint of a frustrated adult or the brief upset of a child who had dropped something. This was deeper, more desperate, the sound of someone who had given up hope, but couldn't stop the tears from coming. Minho followed the sound through a series of increasingly narrow passages. The crowd thinned out as he moved away from the main market areas. The crying grew louder, joined by other voices he couldn't quite make out. Adult voices, harsh and commanding. He rounded a corner and found himself looking down a staircase he hadn't noticed before. The crying was definitely coming from below. A sign near the stairs displayed symbols in several languages, but the only one Minho recognized was standard. Private sale, authorized personnel only. Something cold settled in his stomach. He had heard rumors about places like this, but had never seen one with his own eyes. Every instinct told him to turn around and walk away. This wasn't his business, and getting involved would only create more problems. But the crying continued, and there was something about it that he couldn't ignore. It sounded young, very young. Minho checked that his sidearm was secure in its holster and started down the stairs. The voices became clearer as he descended. Multiple speakers, discussing prices and quality in the casual tone of people buying livestock. The crying had quieted two soft whimpers, as if whoever was making the sound had learned that noise only made things worse. At the bottom of the stairs, Minho found a heavy door marked with more warnings about authorized access. He pressed his ear to the metal and listened. The voices were definitely coming from inside, along with other sounds that made his jaw clench. The whir of machinery, the hum of energy fields, the rattle of chains. Minho's hand moved to the door handle. Everything he had been taught about survival in hostile territory told him to walk away. This wasn't his fight. He had his own problems to solve. The crying started again, weaker now but somehow more heartbreaking. It was the sound of someone who had screamed until their voice gave out, who had fought until their strength was gone, who had hoped until hope itself died. Minho turned the handle and pushed the door open just enough to see inside. What he saw changed everything. Minho slipped through the door and found himself in a nightmare. The room was larger than he had expected, carved out of the station's lower hull like a hidden cave. Dim lights cast long shadows across rows of metal bleachers filled with alien buyers. At the center of the room stood a raised platform surrounded by energy barriers that glowed with deadly power. On that platform, chained to a metal post, was the source of the crying. She was small, no bigger than a human child of 6 or 7 years old. Her body was covered in soft fur that might have been golden once but was now matted and dirty. 2 large ears sat atop her head, drooping with exhaustion and fear. Her face was almost human in shape, but her eyes were huge and golden, filled with tears that caught the harsh lights. A Cathari. Minho had read about them in his xenobiology reports. They were a peaceful species from the Outer Rim, known for their empathic abilities and gentle nature. Their homeworld had gone dark several years ago. Most people assumed they had destroyed themselves in some kind of civil war. Looking at the little girl on the platform, Minho began to understand what had really happened to the Cathari. Next item is very special, boomed a voice that made Minho's skin crawl. The speaker was a massive Vorjak, even larger than the mineral dealer upstairs. His gray skin was covered in scars and ritual markings. Gold teeth gleamed when he smiled. Young Cathari female, age 7, standard years. Fully trained in basic obedience. Natural telepathic abilities intact. The crowd murmured with interest. Minho pressed himself deeper into the shadows near the back wall, trying to stay invisible while his mind reeled. The casual way the auctioneer talked about a child made him feel sick. Bidding starts at 5,000 credits. The Vorjak announced. A thin, insect-like creature in the front row raised a claw. 5,000, 6,000 called out, a blob-shaped alien whose species Minho didn't recognize. The little Cathari girl looked around the room with those huge golden eyes, as if she could see everyone even in the dim light. When her gaze passed over Minho, he felt something strange happen in his mind. It was like a soft touch, gentle but desperate. She was trying to reach out telepathically, searching for anyone who might help her. Minho had never experienced anything like it before. Humans weren't supposed to be telepathic, but somehow he could sense her emotions, terror, loneliness, a pain so deep it made his chest ache, and underneath it all, a tiny spark of hope that someone, anyone, might save her. 7,000 BID. A new voice. This one made Minho's blood run cold. The speaker was a Zephyrian, one of the tall, pale species known for their cruelty. They ran most of the illegal fighting rings in this part of the galaxy. This particular Zephyrian wore expensive clothes and had the soft look of someone who had never worked a day in his life but enjoyed watching others suffer. "Ah, Mr. Kelvin," the auctioneer said with obvious pleasure. "Always good to see you. At our little gatherings," Kelvin smiled, showing pointed teeth. "This one will make an excellent addition to my collection. Her telepathic abilities will be very useful for reading opponents in the fighting pits." The crowd chuckled at what they apparently thought was a joke. Minho realized it wasn't a joke at all. They were talking about using a 7-year-old child as a living lie detector for illegal gladiator matches. 8,000. Kelvin continued casually. The other bidders hesitated. Kelvin had a reputation for getting what he wanted, and few beings were willing to cross him over a slave auction. The insect creature made a gesture that might have been surrender. The blob alien sank lower in its seat. 8,000 going once. The auctioneer called Minho felt the little girl's telepathic touch again, stronger this time. She had somehow focused on him specifically, perhaps sensing that he was different from the others in the room. Her emotions flooded through the connection. "Please, help me, don't let them take me. I want to go home. Mama, Papa, where are my mama and Papa?" 8,000 going twice. The child's terror spiked as she seemed to understand what was happening. She pulled against her chains, but the energy shackles around her wrists glowed brighter, and she cried out in pain. The sound cut through Minho like a knife. 9,000. called a new voice from the middle of the crowd. Everyone turned to look. The new bidder was a Drachmarian, one of the reptilian species known for their slave trading operations. They specialized in training captured beings for various purposes. The Drachmarian's cold eyes studied the little girl like she was a piece of machinery. "Interesting," Kelvin said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "I wasn't aware you dealt in Cathari, Seth." The two Drachmarian's forked tongue flicked out to taste the air. "New markets require new products. This one will bring good prices once properly conditioned." Minho didn't need telepathy to understand what properly conditioned meant. His hands clenched into fists as images flashed through his mind. Training, camps, pain, conditioning, breaking a child's spirit until nothing remained but obedience. 10,000, Kelvin countered, his casual tone now edged with irritation. 12,000, Seth replied immediately. The crowd stirred with excitement. Bidding wars were good entertainment, and the price was climbing higher than anyone had expected. The auctioneer's gold teeth glittered as he smiled. The little Cathari girl seemed to sense the escalating tension. Her telepathic touches became more frantic, reaching out to everyone in the room. Now, but most of the beings present had mental shields or simply didn't care about her distress. Only Minho felt the full force of her desperation. She was losing hope. He could feel it draining away like water through his fingers. Soon there would be nothing left but empty acceptance of whatever fate awaited her. 15,000, Kelvin said, his voice hard as steel. Seth hesitated for the first time. 15,000 was serious money, even for established slave traders. The Drachmarian's tongue flicked out again, tasting uncertainty in the air. 15,000 going once. The auctioneer announced. The little girl's eyes found Minho again across the crowded room. This time the telepathic connection was so strong it made him gasp. She wasn't just asking for help anymore. She was saying goodbye. Somehow, she had recognized him as the one person in the room who cared about her suffering, and she wanted him to know that she understood. He couldn't save her. It was forgiveness from a child who had every right to hate the universe. 15,000 going twice. Something inside Minho snapped. He had been a soldier for 12 years before becoming an explorer. He had seen combat on 4 different worlds and earned decorations for valor under fire. But nothing in his military career had prepared him for the rage that filled him now. The beings in this room saw the little girl as property. They talked about her pain like it was a selling point. They bid on her future suffering like it was entertainment. They had made a mistake, though a big one. They had forgotten that humans came from a death world, and death world predators didn't like it when someone hurt children. Sold to Mr. Kelvin for 15,000 credits. The auctioneer announced with satisfaction. The crowd applauded as Kelvin stood and made his way toward the platform to claim his new property. The little Cathari girl watched him approach. With the resigned terror of someone who knew exactly what kind of life awaited her, Minho stepped out of the shadows and began walking toward the platform. His hand moved to rest on his sidearm, though he wasn't conscious of the movement. Every step brought him closer to a decision that would change everything. The countdown in his head had already started. 40 seconds. That was how long it took for Captain Lee Minho to transform from observer to force of nature. Kelvin reached the platform and extended his hand toward the energy barrier controls. His pointed teeth gleamed as he smiled at his new purchase. The little Cathari girl pressed herself against the metal post, chains rattling as she tried to make herself smaller. "Don't worry, little one," Kelvin said in a voice like poisoned honey. "You'll learn to enjoy your new life soon enough." 35 seconds. Minho's military training kicked in automatically. His mind cataloged the room in microseconds. 43 beings in the audience, most unarmed civilians. 2 Vorjak guards near the main entrance, carrying energy weapons. 4 more guards positioned around the platform, also armed. Emergency exits in the back corners, probably locked from the outside. The auctioneer was reaching for a control panel that would lower the energy barriers around the platform. Once those barriers dropped, Kelvin would take possession of the child and disappear into the station's maze of corridors. 30 seconds. Minho's hand closed around his sidearm. The weapon was a standard Earth military plasma pistol. Reliable and deadly. More importantly, it was designed to work in any atmosphere and wouldn't be stopped by most alien armor types. The beings in this room had made a fundamental error. They knew humans were called Deathworlders, but they thought it was just a scary name. They had never seen what a human could do when something precious was threatened. 20-5 seconds. The energy barriers flickered and began to fade. Kelvin stepped forward eagerly, already reaching for the chains that bound the little girl. She whimpered and tried to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. Minho drew his weapon and fired in one smooth motion. The plasma bolt took the nearest guard in the chest, dropping him instantly. The crowd screamed and scattered as Minho rolled behind a row of seats, already acquiring his next target. 20 seconds. Security breach. The auctioneer roared. Locked down the room. Heavy blast doors began sliding shut over the exits, but Minho had expected that. Trapped spaces were actually an advantage when you knew how to use them. Fewer places for enemies to run, fewer angles to cover. A Vorjak guard near the platform spun toward him, raising an energy rifle. Minho put 2 shots center mass before the alien could pull the trigger. The guard toppled backward, his weapon clattering across the floor. 15 seconds. Kelvin grabbed for the little girl, but she bit his hand with surprisingly sharp teeth. The Zephyrian yelped and backhanded her across the face. The child cried out and fell to her knees, golden blood trickling from her nose. That sound triggered something primal in Minho's brain. The careful, controlled part of his mind that planned and calculated went quiet. What remained was pure human fury, the kind that had helped his species climb to the top of Earth's food chain. 10 seconds. Minho vaulted over the seats and landed. In the center aisle, a guard fired at him, but humans moved differently than other species expected. Where most aliens telegraphed their movements, humans could change direction in mid-stride. The energy bolt passed through empty air as Min dove sideways. He came up firing, his shots precise despite the chaos around him. 2 more guards went down in quick succession. The crowd was in full panic now, aliens stumbling over each other in their desperation to escape. 5 seconds. The auctioneer pulled out a massive weapon, something that looked like it could punch holes in starship hulls, but his hands were shaking with fear, and he had never faced a human in combat before. He fired too early and too wide. The shot going over Minho's head. Minho's return shot was not so forgiving. 40 seconds after he had started moving, Minho stood alone among the fallen guards. The auction room was nearly empty now, most of the crowd having fled through service passages or emergency hatches. Only a few beings remained, cowering behind overturned seats. And on the platform, Kelvin still held the chains that bound the little Cathari girl. "Stay back," the Zephyrian snarled, pulling the child against him. "I'll kill her before I let you take her." Minho walked slowly down the aisle, his weapon trained on Kelvin. His face was perfectly calm, but his eyes held something that made the alien's confidence waver. "Let her go," Minho said quietly. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Human," Kelvin spat. "I have connections throughout this sector. Kill me, and you'll have a dozen crime syndicates hunting you." "Let her go," Minho repeated in the same calm tone. The little girl looked up at him with those huge golden eyes. The telepathic connection was still there, but now, instead of desperation, he felt something else from her. Hope. She had recognized what the others in the room were just beginning to understand. Humans were different. When humans decided to protect something, they didn't stop until the threat was eliminated. "She's just property," Kelvin shrieked, his composure finally cracking. "A slave? Why would you risk your life for a piece of livestock?" Minho's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Kelvin take a step backward. "Because," Minho said softly, "that's what humans do." Kelvin raised his free hand, revealing a small energy blade. "I'll cut her throat. I swear, I will." The little girl's fear spiked through the telepathic link, but underneath it, Minho sensed something else. Trust. Despite everything she had endured, despite being surrounded by beings who saw her as property, she trusted him to save her. That trust was worth more than his own life. Minho holstered his weapon. Kelvin blinked in confusion. "What are you doing?" "Giving you a choice," Minho said, taking another step forward. "You can let her go and walk away, or you can find out why my species conquered a death world. I have a blade to her throat." "Yes, you do." Minho took another step. "But you're not a warrior, Kelvin. You're a parasite who feeds on the suffering of children. And parasites die when they meet real predators." Kelvin's hand shook as he pressed the energy blade closer to the little girl's neck. "Stay back." "I mean it." Minho smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "No, you don't." The Zephyrian's resolve crumbled. He had built his reputation on intimidating beings weaker than himself, but humans were different. They had evolved on a world where everything tried to kill them, where only the strongest and smartest survived. They didn't back down from threats. They eliminated them. Kelvin threw the child aside and lunged at Minho with the energy blade. It was a clumsy, desperate attack, driven by panic rather than skill. Minho sidestepped easily, caught the alien's wrist, and twisted. The blade clattered to the floor as Kelvin screamed. Minho didn't let go. Instead, he applied pressure in exactly the right place to dislocate the Zephyrian's shoulder. "That was for hitting her," he said quietly. Then he hit Kelvin in the solar plexus, doubling him over and sending him gasping to his knees. "That was for scaring her." Finally, he grabbed Kelvin by the throat and lifted him off the ground with one hand. The Zephyrian's feet kicked helplessly as he struggled to breathe. "And this is for buying her in the first place." Minho threw Kelvin across the platform. The alien hit the wall hard and slumped to the floor, unconscious but alive. Barely. The auction room fell silent except for the hum of damaged equipment and the soft whimpering of the little girl. Minho turned to her, his expression softening immediately. She was still chained to the metal post, the energy shackles glowing around her small wrists. Up close, he could see that they had burned her fur and skin. The sight made his jaw clench. With renewed anger, "It's okay," he said gently, kneeling beside her. You're safe now. The child looked up at him with those huge golden eyes, tears still streaming down her furry cheeks. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Are you really going to help me? Minho reached for the energy shackles, examining their locking mechanism. They were designed to contain most alien species, but human hands were different, stronger, more dexterous. Yes, he said simply, I'm going to get you out of here. The shackles sparked and died as he crushed their control circuits with brute force. The little girl's arms dropped to her sides, finally free, after who knew how long, in chains. She stared at her freed hands for a moment, as if she couldn't believe it was real. Then she looked up at Minho and smiled through her tears. Thank you, she whispered. Minho scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she was. What's your name, Zyla? She said softly, then added something in her own language that sounded like music. Nice to meet you, Zyla. I'm Minho. He looked around the ruined auction room, his mind already working on their next move. Let's get you somewhere safe. As he carried her toward the exit, Zyla rested her head against his shoulder. The telepathic connection was still there, but now it carried different emotions: relief, gratitude, and something that might have been the beginning of healing. Behind them, the auction block stood empty, its chains broken, and its barriers dead. The slave market of Volix Prime had just learned what happened when someone made a human angry. Minho carried Zyla through the abandoned corridors of the lower market, his weapon ready and his senses alert. The station's security forces would be mobilizing soon, and staying in one place meant death or capture. But first, he needed to find somewhere safe for the little girl. Where are we going? Zyla asked softly, her small arms wrapped around his neck. Away from here, Minho replied, checking around a corner before moving forward. Do you know if there are other children like you on this station? Zyla's grip tightened. Through their telepathic connection, he felt a wave of sadness mixed with fear. Yes, she whispered. Many. They keep us in the holding pens below the market. Some have been there for months. Minho's jaw clenched. He had hoped Zyla was an isolated case, but deep down he had known better. Operations like this didn't deal in single victims. They were part of something much larger and more horrible. How many? He asked. 30, maybe 40. Different species. All young. Zyla's voice broke slightly. They take the older ones away. We never see them again. The holding pens were 3 levels down from the auction room, accessible through a freight elevator that required special authorization codes. Minho didn't have those codes, but he had something better: human ingenuity and a complete lack of respect for alien security systems. The elevator's control panel sparked and died under his plasma cutter. Within minutes, he had bypassed the safety locks and sent the car plummeting toward the lowest levels of the station. Zyla watched with wide eyes as he worked, amazed by the casual way he dismantled technology that had seemed impossible to overcome. How do you know how to do that? She asked. Humans learn to break things, Minho said simply. It's how we solve problems. The elevator stopped with a grinding noise that echoed through the shaft. The doors opened onto a corridor that smelled like fear, unwashed bodies, and industrial disinfectant. Harsh lights cast everything in sickly yellow, and the air recyclers hummed with the strain of processing to many different atmospheric requirements. Minho set Zyla down, but kept her close as they moved through the corridor. Her telepathic abilities were stronger down here, picking up the emotions of dozens of frightened children. The mental noise made her wince and press closer to his side. There, she said, pointing to a heavy door marked with warning symbols. That's where they keep us. The door's locking mechanism was more sophisticated than the elevator, but not by much. Minho's plasma cutter made short work of the metal housing, exposing the electronic components underneath. A few carefully placed shots disabled the power coupling, and the massive door swung open with a pneumatic hiss. The sight beyond made Minho's blood boil. The holding area was a maze of cages, each one barely large enough for a child to lie down. Energy barriers hummed across the openings, and the air was thick with the sound of crying, whimpering, and frightened voices in a dozen different languages. In the cages were children of every species Minho had ever heard of, and several he hadn't. Furry Kethari, like Zyla, scaled Drachmarians, no bigger than human toddlers. Insectoid hexapods with their multiple limbs folded in despair. All of them were thin, dirty, and marked by the kind of hopelessness that came from weeks or months of captivity. Sweet God, Minho whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The children closest to the door had noticed them. Some pressed against their energy barriers, hope flickering in their eyes. Others cowered in the back of their cages, too broken by their experiences to believe rescue was possible. It's okay, Zyla called out in Standard, then repeated the phrase. In several other languages, this is Minho, he's here to help. A small Brickan child, no more than 5 years old, pressed her furry face against the energy barrier of her cage. Really? She asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Really, Minho confirmed, already moving toward the control panel that managed the cage systems. All of you are going home. The control panel was more complex than the door locks, But human determination had a way of simplifying even the most complicated problems. When finesse failed, Minho fell back on the time-honored human tradition of hitting things until they worked. His plasma cutter carved through the panel's protective housing like it was made of paper. Inside, he found a maze of circuits and power conduits that would have taken hours to decode properly. He didn't have hours. Instead, he shot the primary power coupling. Every energy barrier in the holding area flickered and died simultaneously. For a moment, the children just stared at their open cages in disbelief. Then, slowly, they began to emerge. "Stay together," Minho called out as the rescued children gathered around him. "We need to move quickly and quietly. Can everyone walk?" Most of them nodded, though several of the smaller ones looked shaky on their feet. Malnutrition and fear had taken their toll. Minho quickly assessed the group. 42 children total, ranging in age from about 4 to 12 in human years. Different species, different languages, but all united by their shared suffering. "Zyla, can you talk to all of them?" he asked, but the little Cathari girl nodded. Her telepathic abilities were strong enough to bridge language barriers when emotions were involved. She reached out mentally to the group, sharing feelings of hope and safety that gradually calmed the most frightened children. "They want to know what happened to the guards," she said, after a moment. "Tell them the guards can't hurt anyone anymore," Minho replied grimly, as they made their way back through the corridors. Minho's mind raced ahead to the next problem. 42 children couldn't just walk out of Valix Prime Station unnoticed. They needed transportation, supplies, and most importantly, a safe destination. The nearest civilized system was weeks away by conventional transport. The solution came to him as they reached the freight elevator. The steady hand might be damaged, but her life support systems were still functional. The ship could carry this many passengers if they didn't mind being cramped, and Minho still had those emergency supplies in his cargo hold. But first, they had to get there alive. The elevator ride to the upper levels felt like it took forever. The rescued children huddled together, holding hands and sharing what comfort they could. Despite everything they had endured, they were still children. Some of them had even started to smile. "What's going to happen to us?" asked a young Altarian boy with bright blue skin. "We're going to find your families," Minho said firmly. "All of you." "What if our families are gone?" whispered a Drakmarian girl with silver scales. Minho knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Then we'll find you new families. Good ones. People who will love you and keep you safe." The elevator stopped at the upper market level. Through the doors, Minho could hear the sounds of normal station life continuing. Merchants hawking their wares, travelers negotiating passage. The everyday business of a space station that had no idea what horrors existed in its lower levels. That was about to change. "Stay close," Minho told the children as the doors opened. "We're going to walk through the market like we belong here. Anyone who tries to stop us, you let me handle." They made it exactly 30 meters before the pistol shooting started. Station security had finally traced the disturbance to its source. A squad of armed guards rounded the corner ahead of them, weapons raised and ready to fire. Behind them came 3 Vorjak supervisors, their faces twisted with rage at the loss of their valuable merchandise. "Return the property immediately," the lead guard called out through a translator. "This is your only warning." Minho stepped in front of the children, his plasma pistol appearing in his hand with practiced ease. "These aren't property," he said quietly. "They're children, not according to station law." The guard replied, "Surrender now, and we might let you live." Minho's smile was cold as deep space. "Counteroffer, walk away now, and I might let you live." The guards hesitated. They had heard about what happened in the auction room, but surely one human couldn't take on 6 armed professionals. They were about to learn exactly what a human could do when children were threatened. The firefight was brief and brutal. Station security weapons were designed to stop typical aliens, not humans who moved like liquid death and shot with inhuman precision. Within seconds, 4 guards were down, and the other 2 were retreating in panic. The Vorjak supervisors tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Minho's shots dropped them before they made it 10 meters. "Is everyone okay?" he called back to the children. They stared at him with a mixture of awe and fear. In less than a minute, he had eliminated 6 armed opponents without breaking a sweat. 2 beings from peaceful species. Human combat abilities seemed almost supernatural. "Come on," Minho said, reloading his weapon. "We need to reach my ship before more security shows up." As they moved through the station's corridors, word of their passage spread like wildfire. Some beings fled at the sight of them. Others watched with curiosity or sympathy. A few even offered quiet words of encouragement. The docking bay where the steady hand waited was only 2 levels up, but it felt like the longest walk of Minho's life. Every step brought them closer to safety, but also closer to the station's main security forces. If they were caught in the open, even he couldn't protect 42 children from a full military response. They made it to the docking level without further incident. The steady hand sat in her berth exactly as Minho had left her, damaged but intact. Her airlocks were still functional, and her life support systems hummed with quiet efficiency. Everyone aboard, Minho ordered, helping the smaller children up the ramp. Find somewhere to sit and hold on tight. But your ship is broken, Zyla said, her telepathic abilities picking up his concern about the damaged engines. It's not that broken, Minho replied, sealing the airlock behind them. We might not be able to jump to hyperspace, but we can still fly. And right now, anywhere is better than here. The steady hands engines coughed to life with a sound like grinding metal, but they held together long enough to clear the docking bay. As soon as they were in open space, Minho set course for the nearest inhabited system and pushed the engines as hard as he dared. Behind them, Volix Prime Station grew smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light in the vast darkness of space. For the first time in hours, Minho allowed himself to relax slightly. They had done it. 42 children who had been destined for lives of slavery and suffering were free. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was the beginning of something better. As the ship settled into its long flight toward safety, Minho looked around at the rescued children. Filling his cargo hold, they were talking quietly among themselves, sharing their names and stories, slowly beginning to heal from their trauma. Zyla sat beside him in the pilot's chair, her small hand resting on his arm. Through their telepathic connection, he could feel her contentment and growing sense of security. What happens now? She asked. Minho smiled and activated the ship's long-range communicator. Now we call for help, and we make sure this never happens to anyone else. The rescue was over, but the real work was just beginning. 3 days after escaping Volix Prime, the steady hand limped into Kepler Station, a legitimate trading post in the Centauri system. The station's medical bay was overwhelmed as 42 rescued children received their first proper care in months. Dr. Kim Nara, the station's chief xenobiologist, worked around the clock to treat malnutrition, injuries, and psychological trauma. I've never seen anything like this, Dr. Kim told Minho, as they watched the children being fed and examined. These trafficking operations are supposed to be small-scale, isolated incidents. This is systematic. Minho nodded grimly. Zyla says there are more stations like Volix Prime, dozens of them. The hegemony has been running this operation for years. Dr. Kim was a small woman with kind eyes and steady hands. She had volunteered for Frontier Medical Service after completing her xenobiology degree on Earth. Like many humans in the outer colonies, she had seen enough suffering to understand what needed to be done. What do you need from me? She asked. Help, Minho said simply. These children need more than medical care. They need to find their families, their homeworlds. Some of them have been slaves for so long they don't even remember where they came from. That afternoon, a shuttle arrived from the outer system carrying Park Jisoo, a former Korean Special Forces operator who now worked as a freelance security consultant. Minho had served with him years ago and knew he could be trusted with what they were planning. Jisoo was a compact man, with scars on his hands and eyes that had seen too much combat. He listened quietly as Minho explained what they had discovered on Volix Prime, his expression growing darker with each detail. So you want to go to war with the hegemony? Jisoo said, when Minho finished. Just the three of us. For Zyla corrected from her seat nearby. I'm coming too. Absolutely not, Minho said firmly. You're 7 years old. I'm also the only one who can find the other camps, Zyla replied with surprising determination. My telepathic abilities can locate other Cathari across hundreds of light years, and I know how their systems work. Dr. Kim looked between them. She has a point, and frankly, we need all the help we can get. The authorities won't act on this. Too much political complexity with the hegemony. Jisoo nodded slowly. The kid's right. We need intelligence, and she's our best source. But we do this smart. More charging in with just a pistol. Over the next week, they planned their campaign. Zilla's telepathic abilities revealed the locations of 12 major trafficking hubs scattered across the outer rim. Each one was heavily defended and connected to the others through a network of corrupt officials and criminal contacts. We can't hit them all at once, Jisoo explained as they studied the intelligence reports. But we can make them think we're everywhere at once. Psychological warfare. The first target was a hegemony processing facility on Torvin 3. A mining world where local authorities looked the other way in exchange for bribes. According to Zilla's information, over 100 children were being held there, waiting to be shipped to buyers throughout the galaxy. The assault team consisted of 3 humans and 42 very angry former slaves. You sure about this? Jisoo asked as their borrowed transport ship approached Torvin 3. Using children as bait goes against every rule of warfare. They're not bait, Minho replied, checking his weapons one final time. They're witnesses, and they deserve the chance to help save others. The plan was simple but effective. While Minho and Jisoo created a distraction at the facility's main entrance, Dr. Kim and the rescued children would infiltrate through the service tunnels. Zyla would use her telepathic abilities to locate and calm the prisoners, while the older children helped guide the younger ones to safety. It worked perfectly. The hegemony guards were prepared for military assault, not for children who knew their security systems, and could move through ventilation shafts too small for adults. By the time they realized what was happening, their prisoners were already free, and their facility was in flames. Target secured, Jisoo reported over the comm. 137 children rescued. No casualties on our side. Confirmed, Dr. Kim replied from the extraction point. Medical teams are standing by. But as they prepared to leave Torvin, 3, Zilla's expression grew troubled. Through her telepathic network, she was receiving disturbing information from other Cathari across the galaxy. They know about us, she told Minho quietly. The hegemony has put a bounty on our heads. Every criminal organization in the Outer Rim is looking for us. Good, Minho said with a cold smile. Let them come. The next 6 months became a blur of raids, rescues, and running battles across a dozen star systems. Minho's team grew as they liberated more facilities and recruited new allies. Former slaves who had aged out of the trafficking system joined their cause, bringing skills and knowledge that proved invaluable. Each successful rescue weakened the hegemony's network and emboldened their enemies. Independent traders began refusing to carry suspicious cargo. Colonial governments started asking uncomfortable questions about the source of their cheap labor. Even criminal organizations began to distance themselves from the trafficking operations. Turning point came when they raided a hegemony command center on Nexus Station. Among the intelligence they captured were complete records of the trafficking network, including client lists, financial records, and the locations of every remaining facility. This is it, Dr. Kim said as they analyzed the data. We have everything. We need to bring down the entire operation. But the hegemony wasn't finished. As news of the intelligence leak spread, they began liquidating their assets. Facilities were shut down, records were destroyed, and prisoners were transferred to more secure locations. They're going to disappear, Zyla said urgently. Take all the children to places we can't find them. We have to move, now. The final phase of their campaign required coordination on a scale that seemed impossible. 23 facilities across 16 star systems, all of which had to be hit simultaneously to prevent the hegemony from moving their prisoners. We need help, Jisoo said bluntly. Real help, military support. That help came from an unexpected source. Captain Sarah Chen of the Earth's Colonial Navy had been tracking the team's activities for months. Instead of arresting them, she offered the resources of her battle group. The Colonial Authority has been looking for an excuse to move against the hegemony, she explained during a secret meeting in the Proxima system. You've given us the justification we need. And after Minho asked, what happens to the children? They go home, Chen replied simply. All of them. We've already established contact with the surviving Cathari colonies and several other species. They're ready to receive their lost children. The coordinated assault on the remaining hegemony facilities was swift and overwhelming. Earth colonial forces provided heavy firepower and transport capacity, while Minho's team provided intelligence and specialized skills for dealing with the trafficking operations. Within 72 hours, it was over. The hegemony's trafficking network was destroyed. Over 2,000 children were freed, and the galaxy's attitude toward slavery had changed forever. Standing on the bridge of Captain Chin's flagship, watching the last of the hegemony facilities burn, Zyla took Minho. And, is it really over? She asked. This part is, Minho replied, but there's still work to do. Making sure this never happens again. Through the viewport, they could see the first transport ships arriving to take the rescued children home. For many of them, it would be their first time seeing their homeworlds since they were taken. For others, it would be the beginning of new lives with families who had never stopped looking for them. What about us? Zyla asked. What happens to our family? Minho looked down at the little girl who had become like a daughter to him. Then, at Dr. Kim and Jisoo, who had risked everything to help strangers. They had started as individuals thrown together by circumstance. Now they were something more. We stick together, he said, and we keep fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. The war against the hegemony was over, but the work of healing would take much longer, and somewhere in the galaxy, there were still children who needed someone to hear their cries. For help, Minho smiled as he watched the rescue ships disappear into hyperspace, carrying their precious cargo home. The universe was a dangerous place, but it was also full of people willing to stand up for what was right, even if it meant going to war with the galaxy's most powerful criminals, even if it meant one human against impossible odds, because that's what humans did. 6 months after the fall of the hegemony's trafficking network, Zyla stood on the observation deck of the research station Harmony, watching the star's wheels slowly pass. Her golden fur had grown back thick and healthy, and the scars on her wrist, from the energy shackles, had faded to thin white lines. But the real changes were deeper. She was no longer just a frightened child. She had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a living bridge between human determination and Cathari empathy. The connection is getting stronger, she told Dr. Kim during one of their regular sessions. I can feel other Cathari across the galaxy now, not just nearby ones. Dr. Kim made notes on her tablet, still amazed by what they were discovering. How many can you sense? Thousands, Zyla said softly. Maybe tens of thousands. They're scattered across hundreds of worlds, but they're all connected now. Through me, it had started small. During the raids on the trafficking facilities, Z had reached out telepathically to calm the imprisoned Kethari children, but something unexpected had happened. Instead of just projecting calm, she had created actual links between their minds. Connections that persisted even after they were separated by vast distances. Show me, Dr. Kim said, activating the recording equipment. Zyla closed her eyes and reached out with her mind. To Dr. Kim's instruments, it looked like a sudden spike in neural activity, but to the Kethari across the galaxy, it was something much more profound. On the agricultural world of New Kethra, a young Kethari named Tovin felt Zyla's presence touch his mind. Through the connection, he shared images of the crops he was tending. The satisfaction of seeing green things grow in soil that had never known slavery. On the trading station, Meridian Point, an older Kethari female named Sira shared the joy she felt teaching rescued children how to read and write in their own language, preserving traditions that had nearly been lost. From a dozen other worlds, other voices joined the growing chorus. Former slaves who had found new homes, refugees who had been reunited with their families, children who were learning what it meant to be free. But there was something else in the network. Something that made Dr. Kim's readings spike with alarm. Zyla, are you sharing more than just communication? She asked urgently. The little girl opened her eyes, and for a moment they seemed to hold depths that belonged to someone much older. They're sharing their strength with me, she said simply, and I'm sharing yours with them. Ours, human strength, human determination, the feeling of never giving up, even when everything seems hopeless. Zyla smiled, and it was the expression of someone who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer and chosen hope anyway. They've never felt anything like it before. Dr. Kim's tablet chimed with an incoming priority message from Captain Chen. The news it contained changed everything they thought they knew about what they had accomplished. There's been an uprising on Vorthan Prime, Dr. Kim read aloud. A group of Kethari slaves somehow overpowered their guards and freed an entire labor camp. They're calling it impossible, but the slaves say they felt a sudden surge of courage and strength that gave them the will to fight back. Zyla nodded calmly. Jaren and his group, I felt their fear and sent them what they needed. More reports followed over the next few days. On Kaldris Station, Kethari servants had organized a work stoppage that brought the entire facility to a halt. On the mining world of Zarian, Kethari laborers had somehow sabotaged equipment they weren't supposed to understand, forcing their overseers to negotiate better working conditions. Each incident followed the same pattern. Kethari, who had been passive and resigned, suddenly found the courage to resist their oppression. When questioned, they all gave the same answer. They had felt a presence touch their minds, sharing strength and hope they had never known they possessed. It's spreading, Jisoo observed as they reviewed the reports. Your telepathic network isn't just connecting the Kethari, it's changing them. Not changing them, Zyla corrected, reminding them of what they always were. My people aren't weak, we just forgot how to be strong. Minho studied the tactical reports with growing amazement. These aren't random acts of rebellion, they're coordinated. The Kethari are sharing information and planning joint operations. Because now they know they're not alone, Zyla explained. For the first time in generations, every Kethari in the galaxy can feel that they're part of something larger, a family that stretches across the stars. The implications were staggering. The Kethari had been scattered across the galaxy for decades, sold as slaves or forced into servitude on hundreds of different worlds. They had been isolated, cut off from their own kind, slowly losing their cultural identity and their will to resist. Now, suddenly, they were connected again, and they were angry. The galactic news networks struggled to explain what was happening. Reports flooded in from across the outer rim of Kethari uprisings, work stoppages, and organized resistance movements. Governments that had relied on cheap Kethari labor found themselves facing coordinated demands for fair treatment and civil rights. It's like they're all acting with one mind, reported a correspondent from the Rigel system. But that should be impossible. Kethari telepathy has never worked across interstellar distances before. Dr. Kim smiled as she watched the news coverage. They don't understand what they're seeing. Human stubbornness mixed with Kethari empathy, amplified across a telepathic network that spans half the galaxy. Is this what you intended? She asked Zyla. During their next session, the young Kethari considered the question carefully. I intended to help my people. I didn't know it would work like this, but I'm not sorry it did. Some governments are calling it a terrorist campaign, Dr. Kim pointed out. They want to capture you and shut down the network. Zyla's golden eyes hardened with an expression that was pure human determination filtered through Kethari resolve. Let them try. The first attempt came 3 weeks later. A hegemony remnant group, backed by several corporate interests who profited from Kethari labor, launched a raid on Harmony Station. They came with military-grade ships and professional soldiers, intending to capture Xyla and use her as leverage to control the growing Cathari resistance. They had made a critical error in judgment. They assumed they were facing a single child, and her human protectors. Instead, they found themselves fighting an entire species. The moment the attacking ships appeared on the station's sensors, Xyla reached out through her network. Across the galaxy, thousands of Cathari felt the danger. She was in. More importantly, they felt her determination not to be taken alive. On 17 different worlds, Cathari workers simultaneously abandoned their posts and began sabotaging critical infrastructure. Spaceports shut down, communication networks failed, and manufacturing facilities ground to a halt. Within hours, the economic disruptions spread across multiple star systems. Stop the attack on Harmony Station. The Cathari demands were simple and uniform, or we shut down everything. The attacking force found themselves caught between the station's defenses and a galaxy-wide economic crisis. Their corporate backers, faced with mounting losses, ordered them to withdraw. That was just the beginning, Xyla told Minho as they watched the retreating ships disappear into hyperspace. They'll try again. Then we'll be ready, Minho replied. All of us. But the next attack didn't come from outside. It came from within the network itself. Dr. Kim's instruments detected the anomaly first, a sudden disruption in the telepathic patterns that connected the Cathari across the galaxy. Instead of the harmonious flow of shared emotions and experiences, there were spikes of pain, fear, and something else that made her blood run cold. Xyla, what's happening? She asked urgently. The young Cathari's face was pale, her breathing rapid and shallow. Someone's in the network, she gasped. Someone who isn't Cathari. They're trying to take control. The source of the intrusion became clear when the communications array activated without authorization. A hologram appeared in the station's main conference room, showing the scarred face of a being Dr. Kim recognized from intelligence reports, Gorthak, the Vorjak auctioneer from Valix Prime. Somehow, he had survived Minho's assault and found a way to strike back. Human Gorthak's voice rumbled with hatred. You destroyed my business, now I destroy yours. On the display behind him, they could see what he had done. A young Cathari child, no more than 6 years old, sat strapped to a chair surrounded by electronic equipment. Wires ran from the machinery to her head, and her eyes were wide with terror and pain. Telepathic amplification technology, Dr. Kim whispered in horror. He's using her as a transmitter. Every time your little pet reaches out to her network, Gorthak continued, she increases the signal, and every time the signal gets stronger, it causes more pain to this little one. Eventually, her mind will burn out completely. Xyla cried out and clutched her head as another wave of psychic static flooded the network. Across the galaxy, thousands of Cathari felt the same agony, transmitted through their telepathic connections. You have one choice, human, Gorthak said with obvious satisfaction. Surrender the girl to me, and I will release my prisoner. Refuse, and I will torture every Cathari in the galaxy through their own minds. Minho's hand moved to his weapon, but there was nothing he could shoot. Gorthak was broadcasting from somewhere in deep space, probably aboard a heavily shielded ship. Even if they could locate him, the child would be dead long before any rescue could arrive. There has to be another way, Dr. Kim said desperately. Xyla slowly straightened, her young face set with determination that belonged to someone much older. There is, she said quietly, but you're not going to like it. Through the telepathic network, she could feel the location of Gorthak's ship, and the tortured child he was using as a weapon. More importantly, she could feel the pain that was being broadcast to every connected Cathari across the galaxy. I can reverse this signal, she explained. Instead of receiving the pain, I can send something else. But it will take everything I have. No, Minho said firmly. We'll find another way. There is no other way, Xyla replied with calm certainty. And even if there was, we don't have time. She's dying. Before anyone could stop her, Xyla closed her eyes and reached out through the network with every ounce of her telepathic ability. But instead of trying to block or redirect the torture signal, she embraced it, drew it into herself, and transformed it into something else entirely. Pain became determination. Suffering became strength. Despair became the kind of hope that could move mountains. Across the galaxy, every Cathari in the network felt the change. The agony that had been tearing at their minds was suddenly replaced by something they had never experienced before. The absolute, unshakable conviction that they would never be slaves again. On Gorthak's ship, alarms began screaming as the telepathic amplification equipment overloaded. The tortured child in the chair opened her eyes, and instead of pain, they held the same determination that burned in Xyla's heart. What's happening? Gorthak demanded, but his prisoner was no longer listening to him. She was listening to the voice of every Cathari in the galaxy, all speaking with one mind and one purpose. The restraints holding her to the chair snapped, like paper, as she stood up, her small frame somehow radiating menace that made the massive Vorjak take a step backward. You hurt my family, she said in a voice that carried the weight of an entire species. Now, we hurt you. The last thing Gorthok saw before his ship's systems failed completely was the expression on a 6-year-old's face. It was the look of someone who had found her strength and would never let it be taken away again. Back on Harmony Station, collapsed as the telepathic feedback finally overwhelmed her. Dr. Kim caught her before she hit the floor, checking her vital signs with growing alarm. She's alive, Dr. Kim reported, but barely. The effort nearly killed her. Did it work? Minho asked. Their answer came from the communications array, where reports were flooding in from across the galaxy. On every world where Cathari lived, the scattered members of their species were rising up with a unity and purpose that defied explanation. Centuries of oppression were ending in a matter of hours as an entire people rediscovered their strength. It worked, Dr. Kim said softly. She did it. She saved them all. Zilla's eyes fluttered open, and she managed a weak smile. Not just me, she whispered. All of us, human and Cathari together. 2 years after the Cathari awakening, the galaxy had become a very different place. The old hegemony was gone, replaced by something unprecedented in galactic history. A coalition of former slaves and their human allies who refused to let anyone suffer in chains again. Captain Lee Minho stood on the bridge of the starship Haven, watching as his fleet emerged from hyperspace above the industrial world of Kareth Prime. Below them, the planet's surface was scarred by massive mining operations that had been running for over a century. In those mines, according to their intelligence, over 10,000 beings of various species labored under conditions that amounted to slavery in all but name. Contact from the surface, reported communications officer Park Jisoo from his station. The planetary governor wants to negotiate. Tell him we're not here to negotiate, Minho replied calmly. We're here to liberate his workers. The Haven was unlike any ship that had ever sailed between the stars. Built with a combination of human engineering and alien technology, crewed by former slaves and refugees from a dozen different species. It represented something the galaxy's old powers had never imagined. The oppressed fighting back with the tools of their oppressors. Dr. Kim Nara emerged from the medical bay, where she had been preparing for the casualties they expected from the liberation operation. The field hospitals are ready, she reported. Zilla's coordinating with the Cathari workers in the mines. They're ready to guide our people to the prisoner compounds. Zyla was no longer the frightened child they had rescued from Valix Prime. At 9 years old, she had become the living heart of a telepathic network that connected freed beings across half the galaxy. Her golden fur was streaked with premature silver from the strain of maintaining so many mental connections. But her eyes still held the same determination that had first reached out to Minho in that horrible auction room. The workers are scared, but ready, she reported, her voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible in someone so young. The guards have weapons, but they've never faced organized resistance before. Then let's give them something new to think about, Minho said, activating the ship's general communication system. This is Captain Minho of the Haven to all vessels in the Kareth system. You are supporting a slave operation that violates every civilized law in the galaxy. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences. The response came in the form of weapons. Fire. 3 corporate security vessels opened fire on the Haven, their energy beams lighting up the space between the ships. The attacks might have been devastating against a normal merchant vessel, but the Haven had been built by beings who understood what it meant to fight for survival. Shields holding Jisoo reported, as the ship's defensive systems absorbed the assault. Return fire. Negative, Minho replied. Target their weapons only. We're here to liberate, not to murder. The Haven's return fire was precise and devastating. Human accuracy combined with alien technology stripped the weapons from the attacking ships without damaging their life support or engines. Within minutes, the corporate vessels were helpless, drifting in space with their crews unharmed but their ability to fight completely eliminated. Landing teams deploy, Minho ordered. Liberation of Kareth Prime was swift and overwhelming. The planetary security forces had been expecting smugglers or pirates, not a coordinated assault by beings who had learned to fight from the galaxy's most dangerous predators. Human tactics adapted by alien minds proved unstoppable against guards, who saw their prisoners as property rather than people. But the real victory came from within the mines themselves. As the Haven's forces fought their way through the facility's defenses, the prisoners rose up from below. Guided by Zilla's telepathic network and inspired by stories of other successful libertions, they turned mining equipment into weapons and service tunnels into battlefields. It's like nothing I've ever seen, reported one of the corporate managers who was taken prisoner during the assault. They're not fighting like slaves, they're fighting like soldiers. That's because they're not slaves anymore, Minho replied, as he surveyed the liberated mining complex. They're citizens of a galaxy where freedom matters more than profit. The liberation of Kareth Prime sent shockwaves throughout the remaining corporate hierarchies that had profited from forced labor. More importantly, it demonstrated to oppressed beings everywhere that resistance was possible, that someone would answer when they cried out for help. Over the following months, similar operations unfolded across dozens of star systems. The Haven was joined by other ships crewed by former slaves and sympathetic aliens. What had started as one human's moral outrage had become a galaxy-wide movement that could no longer be ignored or suppressed. The old powers fought back. Of course, corporate security forces were reinforced with military contractors. Corrupt governments passed laws making liberation operations illegal. Criminal organizations put bounties on the heads of anyone associated with the freedom movement. None of it mattered. They still don't understand what they're fighting, Zyla observed as they reviewed intelligence reports about the latest corporate countermeasures. They think this is about economics or politics. They don't realize it's about something much simpler, which is Dr. Kim asked. Right and wrong, Zyla replied with the certainty of someone who had seen both up close. And when humans decide something is wrong, they don't stop until it's fixed. The final confrontation came when the corporate coalition managed to trace the Haven's operations back to Harmony Station. A massive fleet of military contractors and corporate security vessels surrounded the station, demanding the surrender of what they called the terrorist leadership. They want to negotiate, Jisoo reported from the communications station. Nope. Negotiations, Minho replied firmly. Not with slavers, but the enemy fleet wasn't there to negotiate. As soon as their demands were refused, they opened fire on the station. Energy beams and missile barrages lit up space as they tried to destroy the symbol of the liberation movement in one overwhelming assault. They had made a fatal error in judgment. The attackers had assumed they were facing a single station and its defenders. Instead, they found themselves fighting an entire network of former slaves who had learned to coordinate their actions across vast distances. On 17 different worlds, Cathari workers and critical facilities received urgent telepathic message. Within minutes, power grids failed, communication networks went dark, and spaceports shut down. The corporate fleet found itself cut off from resupply and reinforcement. Stranded in hostile space with no way to call for help at the same time, ships began emerging from hyperspace around Harmony Station. Dozens of vessels crewed by former slaves and their allies, converging on the battle from across the galaxy. Each ship flew the same flag, a broken chain on a field of stars, the symbol of the Haven Protocol. "This is impossible," transmitted the corporate fleet commander as he found himself outnumbered 3-1. "Our intelligence said you only had a few ships." "Your intelligence was wrong," Minho replied from the Haven's bridge. "We have something your corporations never understood. We have people who believe in what we're fighting for." The battle was brief and decisive. Corporate security forces were trained to intimidate civilians and suppress worker uprisings. They had no experience fighting beings who had learned combat tactics from humans and applied them with the creativity of species fighting for their survival. More importantly, they were fighting people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Former slaves who would rather die free than live in chains. Refugees who had found new homes and families worth defending. Children who had grown up knowing that somewhere in the galaxy, someone was always listening for their cries for help. "Surrender," Minho transmitted to the surviving corporate vessels. "Lay down your weapons and prepare to be boarded." "What are your terms?" the corporate commander asked. "No terms," Minho replied. "Justice." The aftermath of the Battle of Harmony Station marked the end of systematic slavery in the known galaxy. The corporate coalition that had supported the old system collapsed as their operations were systematically dismantled by liberation forces. Corrupt governments found themselves facing internal uprisings as their own oppressed populations demanded the same freedom that others had found. Most importantly, the Haven Protocol became the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization. The document that Minho and his team had drafted during those first desperate months established principles that had never existed before: the right of all sentient beings to freedom, dignity, and protection from exploitation. "It's not perfect," Dr. Kim observed as they watched the first Haven Protocol enforcement ships patrol former slave routes. "There are still places where people suffer, still systems where the old ways persist. But now they know they're not alone," Zila added, her telepathic senses reaching out across the growing network of freed beings. "And they know that someone will come when they call for help." Minho nodded as he watched the stars wheel past the observation deck. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness between the worlds, there were still children crying in chains. But now there were also people listening for those cries. People who would cross any distance and face any danger to answer them. "What's our next mission?" Jisoo asked, studying the intelligence reports that continued to flow in from across the galaxy. "Same as always," Minho replied with a smile that held no warmth for those who would harm the innocent. "Someone, somewhere, needs help, and we're going to give it to them." On the bridge of the Haven, Zyla closed her eyes and reached out through her telepathic network. Across hundreds of worlds, thousands of former slaves felt her presence and knew they were part of something larger than themselves. They were part of a family that stretched across the stars, united by the simple belief that no one should suffer alone. The little alien girl who had once cried in chains had become the heart of a new galaxy, one where freedom was not a privilege but a right, and at her side stood the human who had heard her cries and decided that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The Deathworlders had kept their promise. They had answered when children cried for help, and they would keep answering, for as long as there were chains to be broken and children to be saved, because that's what humans do. That's what family does. And in a galaxy full of wonders and terrors, there was no force more powerful than a human who had decided to protect something precious. The old powers had learned that lesson too late. The new galaxy would be built on the understanding that some things were more important than profit, more valuable than power, and worth any sacrifice to protect. Freedom, dignity, the right of every child to grow up safe and loved. These were the principles of the Haven Protocol, written in the blood of slavers and the tears of the liberated. They would endure as long as there were humans to enforce them and children who needed someone to answer their cries. In the end, that was all the justice the galaxy needed.